Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 gubernatorial elections and mapping out the starting point, I believe, that we're at right now. So, these elections are going to be really interesting, I think, because, first of all, gubernatorial elections are always, they can always yield kind of random results. And I see that because they're local, so they're less influenced by factors at the national level that are easier for everyone to know about, right? Like, we know who's going to win 45 out of 50 states in the 2024 presidential election. We know who's going to win, all but 4 or 5 Senate seats come 2024. Governor's races, we may think we know, but they will, produce really localized results that maybe, if there's a race in, say, New Hampshire, people in California maybe won't know what's influencing their vote, even if they know it's influencing their vote presidentially. So, I just want to look at these elections because I do want to have a starting point, and I also think they're interesting. So, let's start off with our safe Democratic states, as we always do. And Washington and Delaware, these are both states where you have incumbent Democratic governors who are not running for re-election. In Washington, Jay Inslee is retiring. In Delaware, John Carney is term limited. Both these states are blue states. And again, if we see a local factor impact either of these states, I'll move it down to likely or whatever rating I deem to be most sufficient. But for now, they're blue states. Democrats have strong benches in both of these states. And we also don't really have any signs of competitiveness, right? Like, there are some states that are open seats where, there's a sign of a competitive campaign. Neither of these states have those, signals emerging just yet. So if they do emerge, I'll move them down. But for now, they're safe. We see, kind of the opposite situation in a state like Utah, North Dakota, or Missouri. Utah's not exact because Utah does have an incumbent Republican, but North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana, and West Virginia are all states where you have, in these 3 states, Republican governors who are term limited, I believe. And in North Dakota, Doug Burgum is running for president. So we have open seats in red states that are likely going to be held by Republicans. I think the only one that is even the slightest bit interesting is Missouri, because in 2020 it was considered to be competitive. We actually saw a lot of polls that showed, the race pretty close. And even on the day before the last days of October, we saw a poll showing Galloway, only down by 6, and race ratings for this election were pretty all over the place. But most of the consensus was that Parsons would win narrowly, and so, it's a state where Democrats had a chance to win in 2020 and, ended up underperforming severely. So I don't think it's going to flip, but I do think it could be interesting to see whether or not whoever the Republicans run in 2024 does better or worse than Parson. But aside from this, these are all safe red states. Utah will be interesting to watch the primary because I think Spencer Cox could get primaried out. He's a more moderate governor in a pretty Republican state, so often we'll see Republicans get primaried, but I don't think he's at real risk if he makes it to the general election. We see a similar thing in Vermont. Phil Scott, I don't know if he's going to run. He hasn't said anything about it yet, so there's a chance he retires, but if he does run for re-election, he will win. He won by 40 points in 2022. There's no reason to think that he would even be in a competitive spot for 2024. And then the last red state that I want to characterize right now is Montana. Montana, I'm going to move down to likely, and I say that because in 2020 we saw Greg Gianforte win this race, but it was, he underperformed Trump by a couple points, and we also have seen that his approval rating hasn't been ideal. It's been fine. It'll be good enough to likely secure him a second term. But again, we don't know who the Democrats are going to run here. In 2020, they ran the Lieutenant Governor, Mike Cooney, and obviously he lost, but Montana is a weird state, quite frankly. They like to vote for Democrats in local offices. Even in 2022, Democrats almost won a congressional seat here, despite the fact that no one even thought it would be remotely competitive. So Montana's interest. I also think that I want to have a bit of caution for Gianforte because we have a Senate race here in 2024. John Tester running for re-election. I don't know if he'll win, but either way, he'll make it close, and that will potentially drag up Democrats, down the ballot and make the races more competitive than they would have otherwise been. So I'm just going to say that it's a likely Republican race. Gianforte is not at risk of losing right now, but it will be closer than I think some people are expecting. And so that leaves the 2 interesting races, North Carolina and New Hampshire. And I want to start with New Hampshire because New Hampshire is entirely based on one thing and one thing only, and that is whether or not Chris Sununu runs for re-election. So we don't know whether he's going to run or not. He hasn't said anything. There was talk of him running for president, but he hasn't, really said anything. And so on the Wikipedia page, you'll see his decision is expected in the summer, and obviously it's summer now. It'll probably come in July or August as he prepares for, actually filing to run. But let's say he doesn't run. Democrats would have, a fair share of their candidates. I think Joyce Craig would be the best option for them. She's the mayor of Manchester, the largest city in the state, and she's, from what I've heard, decently popular. That's, at a statewide level, we don't know because she hasn't run for statewide office yet. We'll have to wait and see how she polls. But I think if she runs against any other Republican on this list not named Chris Sununu, it's, to me, a lean D race. And that's because none of these other Republicans, I think, are good enough. Chuck Norris, I think, would be their best candidate. But again, he's not someone that is, I think, good enough to be Joyce Craig because he ran for Senate in 2022. He lost in the primary to Don Bolduc. And he is, not unelectable, but he's also a pretty conservative candidate. And he's much more of a, right-wing personality than Chris Sununu, who is a very moderate governor. And so Chuck Norris, I think, would be a decent nominee, but I still think he'd lose. And then Frank Edelboot, who I guess was the former commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Education, would be decent. But again, he ran in 2016, lost the primary. Then Bob Burns, who ran for Congress, he lost by 10 points to Ann Custer in the 2nd district. So I don't think any of these candidates are world beaters. I think Chuck Norris is fine. Edelboot, I don't know as much about, but I think that he'd be serviceable. But the best candidate on this list that I've seen is likely Joyce Craig, and I think that if she runs, it's a lean D race. For now, I don't know, so I'm just gonna put it in lean D because I think Chris Sununu is gonna retire. If I had to guess, I think he retires. But to be honest, I don't really. It really depends on him. If he runs, it's likely Republican, if not safe. But let's just say he doesn't run. I'll put it in the lean Democratic column. And so that leaves us with North Carolina, which is an open seat. We know Roy Cooper, the incumbent Democrat, can't run for re-election, and that's unfortunate for Democrats because he's popular. He won by 4.5 points in 2020, and if you remember, he outran both Biden and Cal Cunningham, and so he was the only Democrat. He wasn't the only Democrat, but he was the main Democrat to win statewide North Carolina in 2020, and so without him, Democrats are kind of looking for an alternative. They're likely to run Attorney General Josh Stein, who he's why I corrected myself. He did win statewide in 2020, but he only won by 0.2%. He won a very close race. It was 50.1, 49.9. And so he would, be a bit weaker than Roy Cooper. He's a strong candidate, don't get me wrong, but he'd be a bit weaker than Roy Cooper. But the good news for Democrats, I guess their saving grace here, is that the Republican candidate is likely to be Mark Robinson. And he's the lieutenant governor, so he has won statewide before, but he is a very, very right-wing candidate. He is kind of a Doug Mastriano type. He, believes the election was stolen, has made a huge name for himself, going all in on the culture war with, transgender individuals, has made a lot of controversial statements over his time in office. And he's just overall, I think, a below-average candidate. I think they'd be better running Mark Walker, who is the former representative from the 6th District. He ran for Senate, lost the primary back in 2022. But if Walker gets the nomination, I think it's maybe a tilt Republican race. But if it's Mark Robinson, I'm putting it in the tilt Democratic column. Robinson versus Stein, I think, would be very bad for Republicans. Josh Stein, again, is a bit weaker than Roy Cooper statewide, but he still won. He outran Biden by 2 points, and he's a decent candidate in his own right. He's, someone who I think is going to run a good campaign. He's experienced, and this race kind of reminds me of Pennsylvania from last year because you have a Democratic Attorney General who overperformed and won in both 2016 and 2020 and outran both Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden both times. And you also have, on the other side, a Republican who's very extreme and likely to be viewed controversially by even his own counterparts. Doug Mastriano, and the reason that he'd lost in part was because he got cut off in funding from his Republican, allies in Washington very early on. I think we see a similar thing with Mark Robinson if he gets the nomination. So, that's my prediction for right now. A lot's going to change, especially New Hampshire. The second Sununu says he's going to run for re-election, I'll move it back to Republican. But I think for now, if I had to guess, I say he retires. So, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.